And now it's time for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs. Last week, South Koreans elected the Conservative People Power Party's Yoon Suk-yeol to lead the country for the next 5 years from this May. Today, we will touch upon the new president-elect's diplomatic stance, especially with regard to neighboring Japan. As many of us already know, diplomatic tensions between Seoul and Tokyo have run deep since 2019, when Japan imposed a set of export restrictions against South Korea in a move seen as economic retaliation for Korean court rulings against Japanese firms involved in forced labor during Japan's 1910 to 45 colonial rule. There were other issues ranging from Tokyo's bid to have the Sado mines listed as UNESCO World Heritage Site, as well as Japan's claims to Korea's easternmost islets of Dokdo, its wartime sexual slavery, and its planned discharge of tainted nuclear plant water into the ocean. For more in-depth analysis of future Seoul-Tokyo ties, we're joined by Alexis Dutton, Professor of History at the University of Connecticut, and Bong Young-sik, Research Fellow at Yonsei Institute for North Korean Studies via Skype. Thank you so much both for joining us.
Thank you.
Pleased to be here.
So let's begin with Yoon's first press conference. Throughout his campaign and even after he was elected, Yoon Suk-yeol has stressed building a future-oriented relationship with Japan. So Dr. Bong, what does Yoon exactly mean by future-oriented ties?
There is a clear recognition in the remarks made by the President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol during the presidential election campaign trail and after he was officially elected to be the next president. The bilateral tie between Seoul and Tokyo is so strained that there should be immediate and effective restoration. And he pledged that if he gets elected to be the next president, he will put all the critical issues on the table and make a big deal with the Japanese government. And it is very positive that the Kishida government of Japan positively and without wasting no time to responded to this message once the election result in South Korean presidential election came out.
Now, like Dr. Bong just pointed out, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida was the second foreign leader Yoon spoke to over the phone since being elected after U.S. President Joe Biden. Kishida congratulated Yoon for his victory, and the two sides vowed to cooperate in mending relations. So, Professor Dutton, how do you see this? How do you think ties would change compared to the current Moon Jae-in administration?
Well, obviously, it's what we all hope happens is that better ties resume. It's been an unfortunate several years. This has also been compounded by COVID, right? So there haven't been any civil society engagements as well. It's welcome news that Prime Minister Kishida was congratulatory. Some substance would be good to see. It would be really helpful, for example, if Prime Minister Kishida made a conciliatory gesture and dropped the export restrictions, for example. I mean, that would welcome a conversation between the two leaders.
And what about you, Dr. Bong? President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol said that he will reaffirm the 1998 Kim Dae-Jung-OBUCHI declaration to improve Korea-Japan relations. So for starters, what was the declaration about, and do you think he will be able to revive the friendly spirit?
The 1998 Kim Dae-Jung-OBUCHI joint declaration was a landmark achievement by both leaderships and for both countries, which pledged to have the relationship of the two countries move forward for the future without being shackled by the shadow of the unfortunate past. So Yoon Suk-yeol, although he is coming from the conservative section of the Korean politics, is committed to emulating the successful example of the Kim Dae-Jung-OBUCHI declaration led by progressive leadership of former President of South Korea, Kim Dae-jung. The challenge for President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol is that, unlike the case of President Kim Dae-jung, he is not going to enjoy strong support and understanding from his critics belong to the progressive sector of the Korean government. So he needs to lay out very strong and persuasive reasons and justifications to enter into pragmatic negotiations with the Japanese government, despite a very strong anti-Japanese sentiment in South Korean public. And he is going to face a very important local election on June 1st. So how to deal with the strong anti-Japanese sentiment and goal to win the local election in June as a first test case for his leadership is going to be a very important test for President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol.
Well, so we will have to wait and see, but it's a known fact that he has a lot on his plate. But now to Professor Dutton, since more than 2 years have passed since the leaders of South Korea and Japan held a summit, President-elect Yoon said during his presidential debate that he would meet the U.S. president first, followed by the Japanese prime minister, Chinese president, and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. So what do you think is the reasoning for ordering meetings this way? And when can you expect Yoon to actually meet Prime Minister Kishida?
Well, it's an excellent question, and some of the conversation that's come up with Professor Bong as well, we're hearing echoes of the 1990s, right? Future-facing Kim Obuchi, and now we're back to the order of the traditional alliance, which is meet with Washington, meet with Japan, China, and then North Korea if you decide to. So in that sense, it's sort of back to the future. I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, because I think what we all need to recognize, especially outside of Seoul-Tokyo nexus, is that especially in Washington, the only thing on people's minds right now is the crisis in Ukraine, is Russia's invasion. So meeting with Biden when he can makes sense. We had heard that President Biden was likely to try to go to Tokyo in late May. If that can happen, it would make logical sense for Biden to go to Seoul to show his equal support to South Korea. Even better would be to meet all three together. But who knows when this can happen? I do think, and I'll be very brief, I do think that while some viewers may disagree, at least many South Korean diplomats have tried very hard to reach out to Japanese counterparts during the Moon administration. And there is equal, Professor Bong just discussed the anti-Japanese sentiment in the South Korean populace. There is equal enmity in Japan. And so rushing off to meet in Seoul is not on anyone's minds in Japan. And so you've got these populations that need to be brought together by their leaders. And it would be very helpful if President Biden took a strong, helpful role in coordinating that.
But Dr. Bong, Japan's current Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, who took office late last year, is seen as relatively dovish in the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. So some experts say he's currently being cautious as he could not risk political ramifications ahead of the parliament's upper house election in July. Do you think the Kishida administration will likely maintain its so-called hardline stance on Seoul until the election? And how can things change after the election?
Well, Prime Minister Kishida was the foreign minister who actually personally involved in the joint declaration of the formal and irreversible end of the wartime conflict women's sex slavery by the Japanese military with his counterpart in 2015. But unfortunately, the agreement has been scrapped by South Korea. So Kishida leadership has every reason to maintain hardline policy based upon lack of mutual trust toward South Korean leadership. That has been the defining feature of Japan's approach to the Moon Jae-in government of South Korea. But at the same time, Kishida government has every reason to be pragmatic for the sake of winning the election you mentioned, as well as augmenting international standing of Japan. So I hope that there will be pragmatic elements emerging in next steps taken by the Kishida government of Japan toward the President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol, because this is a very rare but important opportunity made available to both sides. So what should be done? I agree with Professor Dutton that there should be a round of give and take. Ending export control restriction on South Korea and putting back South Korean companies on the white list to promote the mutual trade relations would be a very nice gesture made by the Japanese side. And in return, the South Korean government can be more flexible about Japan's application of the Sado mine as a UNESCO heritage. So if there be a good round of a give and take made by both sides, then the public atmosphere will be softened in favor of supporting the improvement of the strained bilateral relationship. And one good thing is that Japan and South Korea's choices have been made simple because of the Russia's military invasion of Ukraine, which highlights the premium of being security partner with the Free West led by the United States and the strategic competition between China and the United States. So considering the changing aspects of the global security environment, then South Korea and Japan are having more and more reasons to improve their partnership in global standing rather than remaining in the very strained bilateral relationship of the past.
Well, Dr. Bong just touched upon these Sado mines as well, but we'll delve more into this right now. When it comes to the Seoul-Tokyo ties, historic atrocities have always been an obstacle. And like you said, recently, Japan's drive to list a mine on Sado Island, which is associated with Korean forced laborers as a UNESCO heritage site, has sparked tensions. So since taking office in October, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has repeated Tokyo's mantra, Seoul should first contrive acceptable solutions to resolve the matter. So Professor Dutton, as an expert in the field, how should the incoming Yoon administration face this issue?
Well, this isn't an open disagreement with Professor Bong. I think the Sado mine specifically is problematic. And again, this has far less to do with Tokyo-Seoul relations than it has to do with divisions in Japanese society. And that's difficult to see from South Korea's position especially. But let's bear in mind, Prime Minister Kishida himself did not want this application to go forward. Pressure from the hard right flank of his party pushed this forward. This application is particularly difficult because it intentionally erases the history of the 20th century, and especially the history of forced Korean labor. What I think works better for South Korea, rather than simply attack this particular application, as Professor Bong is saying, is go as broad as possible. If South Korea really reaches out internationally and says, we're not opposed to Japan having a UNESCO heritage site, let's include the 20th century. And interestingly, many Japanese support that position. And that's the kind of flexibility that I think we're talking about here. Simply rejecting every South Korean offer, especially over historical atrocities that are well documented, only fuels anti-Japanese sentiment in South Korea. And worse, it actually alienates Japan from the international community in the long run. And so as broad-minded as the Yoon administration can be, the better.
Well, there seems to be a lot of sensitive issues that the two countries have to face. But now on the economic front, as we touched upon earlier, in 2018, South Korea's Supreme Court upheld the lower court rulings that awarded compensation to laborers forced to work for a Japanese company during the World War II. The following year, Japan imposed an export ban on semiconductor materials to Korea, and the two countries ended up removing each other from their whitelist of preferred trading partners. But with the incoming administration, can we expect economic interchanges to improve? How do you see things, Dr. Bo?
Well, at the end of the day, business is the trump card and the most important, well, business for both countries, for mutual and individual benefits of the country. So I believe that there is ample room for the leaderships on both sides to be pragmatic, to promote the mutual interest. And interesting phenomenon coming out of the very unfortunate situation in Ukraine and the rise of the tension between China and the United States is no longer possible. It is to clearly separate politics and economics. It has been the guiding principle for South Korea's approach to China that we will do business mainly with China, but we're going to keep politics independent from business. And we keep our close security partnership with the United States. That balancing act has less and less place for South Korea, as clearly demonstrated by the West's response to Russia's military invasion of Ukraine. Now, economics go with national security, and South Korea not fulfilling its expected role as a global economic power and liberal democracy is going to hurt South Korea itself. Not because of the moral reasons and norms undermining substantive economic interest, but in order for countries like South Korea to protect their pragmatic business interests, they have to live up to the expectation as a free market economy and liberal democracies. In that regard, South Korea and Japan are in the same category. So I would say that there's ample room to maneuver together and cooperate with each other between South Korea and Japan in the long run, despite the task that the new leadership has to come up with a workable solution with regard to court decisions in favor of the plaintiffs. But by the way, lower courts of South Korea had a different opposite ruling in favor of maintaining the basic content of the 1965 Normalization Treaty with Japan.
Well, I'm afraid we will have to wrap up our discussion at this point. It was very interesting. I learned a lot, but we will have to wrap up. So I appreciate you both coming on, and thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.